What you see is a man that I've come to know and respect. A humble American patriot. A man of common sense and decency. Quite simply, one of our nation's finest public servants.
President Obama awarded the Medal of Freedom to Robert Gates in 2011. Since then, the former Defense Secretary has written a no-holds-barred book, Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary of War, and Robert Gates is back with me now. Let's talk about Afghanistan and the current state of what is going on there. Clearly, American troops are due to come out, but there is increasing pressure now from the leaders in Afghanistan to keep a military presence from America longer. Is that a good idea, do you think?
I think it's actually essential. We turned our backs on Afghanistan after the Soviets left at the end of the 1980s, and within a couple of years, civil war in Afghanistan brought the Taliban to power and a safe haven for al-Qaeda. So I think that having a residual force there of 8, 10, 12,000 U.S. and allied troops not only is a signal to the Taliban we're not abandoning Afghanistan, but also I think will give confidence and heart to the Afghans themselves. It's also a message to the neighbors, such as Pakistan, that we're not going to walk away. The Pakistanis have been afraid all along that once we tired of this war, that we would leave the region and they would have to deal with the consequences of this long war. So I think having this residual presence and the strategic agreement that the president and his team have negotiated with Afghans is exactly the right thing to do.
The book has got a lot of controversy attached to it. It's a major work. It's got 600 pages or more, and I'm sure that you would say that some stuff's been taken out of context. But in terms of the central criticism, many people feeling that you revealing that President Obama himself doubted his own strategy in Afghanistan was pretty disloyal and pretty damaging to morale of troops on the ground there who are still fighting for their country. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I don't think it would have any impact on the morale of the troops still fighting there, because the reality is the president has made a number of decisions with respect to Afghanistan, and he has stuck to those decisions. And I agreed with all of those decisions, including, as I just mentioned, his willingness to have a strategic agreement that would prolong the U.S. military presence, or at least some small number of U.S. forces beyond December of 2014. All the policy decisions with respect to Afghanistan have been made. The drawdown schedule is set, and we know what will happen. So I think that what I have said in this book really is that I agreed with all of the president's decisions. There were two things about Afghanistan and our debates on Afghanistan that troubled me. One was the fact that the politics became part of the debate in the way that it did. But another was his suspicion of the motives of senior military officers in trying to get him, persuade him to add additional forces. And I guess there would be a third, which is that although he made these courageous decisions with respect to Afghanistan, he seemed unwilling to ever go before the public and say why this war was necessary, why the cause of these servicemen and women was noble and just, and why their sacrifice was worthwhile. And it was that lack of passion, that lack of open conviction about the importance of success in Afghanistan that troubled me, because the troops out there in Afghanistan know the score, and they know that they're not hearing that message from the commander-in-chief. His reservations that I talk about, I think as much as anything, were not so much about the military campaign as they were a number of other aspects of the strategy that weren't working. And that was part of the strategy was to try and get Pakistan to stop its hedging in the event we would lose or leave Afghanistan, to try and get the Karzai government to be more competent and less corrupt, to get more civilians from the U.S. and our allies in there to help with development projects and help make the government more effective. These things weren't working very well. And military strategy, the military campaign, was taking longer than the military had told the president it would. And people may remember the campaign around Marja, where we talked about the Afghans coming in with government in a box, quote unquote, and so that went slower, and then the campaign against Kandahar went slower. So I think those were the foundations of the president's reservations that I refer to. But the fact remains that he took the decisions that were important.
Right. Right, but here would be my obvious question, I guess, which is, you're absolutely entitled to have your opinions about this, but given that you were serving in his administration, and given he's still the president, and given the conflict in Afghanistan is ongoing, shouldn't you have really waited until President Obama had seen out his term of office and US troops had come home before putting all this in the public domain? Is it really a patriotic duty to do this before those two things have happened?
I think it is important for Americans, and particularly our men and women in uniform, to understand the debates that went on in Washington and to humanize and personalize those debates so that they know that these issues were debated seriously, that there was a lot of passion involved, that the president asked hard questions. People are concerned about my talking about presidential conversations, but the reality is, in the book, virtually all of the president conversations that I describe in the book are positive in terms of what they reveal about both President Bush and President Obama, in the respect that it shows these presidents asking hard questions, pushing back on the military, and asking the kinds of questions that Americans would hope their commander-in-chief is asking.
It is, but to actually say publicly in a book, as his former defense chief, that the President of the United States doesn't believe in his own strategy with one of the most important wars the country has ever been engaged in, many see as being flagrantly disloyal.
Well, I don't think it's being disloyal, and I think that, again, the book makes very clear that I agreed with all of the president's decisions on Afghanistan, and I supported those decisions. I believe they were the right decisions, and he has continued to adhere to those decisions, whatever reservations he has. I also describe earlier in the book President Bush's reservations about the strategy in Iraq, and that his reservations led to reviews of strategy in Iraq and a change of strategy in Iraq. So I think in both cases what I'm trying to show is that presidents have reservations when they've committed military forces, and they ask themselves hard questions, and they ask those working for them hard questions.
Let's turn to another gripping part of the book, which is that you were one of the people who was at the White House in the Situation Room watching the capture and indeed killing of Osama bin Laden. What was that like to be in that room? Because it looked incredibly tense from the images we've seen. Well, we see you there lower right in this picture that we're looking at now.
When the raid began, we were in the larger Situation Room, and the president disappeared. And when we inquired where he'd gone, there was a room across the hall where there was a video feed where we could see what was actually going on in the compound at Abbottabad, and also could hear the team communicating. And so that's the room where that picture was taken, and I think clearly there was a huge amount of tension in the room. When we got we were able to follow everything until the SEALs entered the house, but once they entered the house, we really didn't know what was going on for perhaps 15 minutes, which was probably the longest 15 minutes in any of our lives. And then we heard the statement from the SEAL, Geronimo, enemy killed in action. So I think that there was a great sense of relief that the mission had been successful in extracting justice from this terrorist, but there was no high-fiving, there were no cheers or anything like that. First of all, because the SEALs still had to get out of Pakistan, and that was another hour or so, and we still needed to get Osama's remains and all of the intelligence that we had collected out of Pakistan. But I think there was just a quiet sense that those Americans who had been killed on September 11th had been avenged.
You seemed perturbed in the book that, having had a pact between all of you in the room not to talk about any of this publicly, people immediately did within a few hours.
Well, saying I was perturbed would be saying would be putting it in the most polite possible terms. As we began to break up at the end of that meeting, I said, "Now look, we use these tactics and techniques in Afghanistan and elsewhere virtually every night. And if we go out and start talking about how we did this, the details of this mission, it will put future special operators in jeopardy." And everybody agreed. So I said, we need to take a blood oath among ourselves. We won't, all we'll say is that Osama bin Laden has been killed, and we will not discuss the operation itself. That lasted, and everybody agreed, and that lasted about 5 hours. And it was very disappointing for all the reasons that I just described.
Let's take a short break. Come back and talk about what you really think about Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden.